Welcome to the Book Crush Diaries, where every story has a heartbeat. And don't miss to hit the like, share and subscribe. Let's start our today's story, Her Rejected Mate, Her Ruthless King. Chapter 1. The scent of damp earth and excited wolf adrenaline usually felt like home, like a blanket woven from the pack's shared breath. Tonight, it felt like a spotlight on my worst secret. I was Elara, and in the shadow pack, to be Elara was to be nothing. Look at her, still clinging to the edges, came the low, sneering whisper of Ronan, the Alpha's beta. His words might as well have been shouted. Everyone in the gathering circle, bathed in the moonlight of the mating ceremony, shifted their eyes. A swift, dismissive glance that landed on me for a millisecond before snapping back to where the true power lay. That power belonged to my cousin, Lysandra. Lysandra was a supernova of fake light and effortless grace. Her silver-furred wolf had manifested years ago, strong and blindingly beautiful. She stood at the center of the clearing, surrounded by admirers, her auburn hair a fiery halo, her laughter ringing false and brittle. She was everything I was not, acknowledged, desired, wolfed. I stood against a gnarled oak, a girl made of shadows and silence. I was 19, and I still hadn't shifted. Not even a glimmer, a spark, a twitch of a spirit wolf. I was a null, a genetic dead end, a curse whispered in the halls. They treated me like a broken doll waiting to be discarded. But tonight, the sliver of hope I had guarded for years was all that kept me breathing. Tonight, Alpha Daemon, the pack's leader and the most potent male I had ever seen, would step forward. Tonight was when the fates decided our pairings. I closed my eyes, a silent, desperate prayer twisting in my gut. Please, let me be his. If he claims me, they have to see me. If he accepts me, I'll finally belong. I pictured him, Daemon, with his midnight hair and eyes the color of storm clouds. He was ruthless in battle, but I'd seen the rare, gentle curve of his mouth when he thought no one was looking. I'd seen the way his hand twitched sometimes when he passed me in the training yard, as if he felt a faint, phantom pull. Maybe I wasn't wolfed, but I was fated. Suddenly, the crowd silenced. Daemon walked into the center of the ring, his presence a heavy, intoxicating pressure. The air grew thick, electric. He was a masterpiece of muscle and primal energy, and the sheer power radiating off him made my skin prickle with an ache I couldn't name. His eyes scanned the crowd, and my heart hammered against my ribs, ready to burst. They paused. They lingered. They were looking straight at me. A dizzying wave of pure, undeniable mate bond recognition slammed into my chest. It was a jolt of raw, molten electricity, a connection so instantaneous and powerful it brought a sob to my throat. It was real. It was mine. Tears sprang to my eyes. Relief, triumph, and sheer, dizzying joy threatened to make me pass out. He saw me. He felt it too. I was safe. I was loved. Daemon took a step toward me. Then another. The crowd held its breath. Lysandra's perfect face twisted into a snarl of shock. He stopped directly in front of me. I looked up, ready to meet my salvation, ready to let the power of our bond wash away years of humiliation. Instead, his storm cloud eyes narrowed, and his lips curved into a slow, chilling sneer that cut deeper than any blade. How interesting, he drawled, his voice carrying clearly in the silent clearing. It was a predator's purr, devoid of warmth. He reached out, not to cup my cheek, but to grab a strand of my mouse brown hair between his thumb and forefinger. Then, with a casual flick of his wrist, he tossed it away. His voice dropped, dripping with contempt, and the mate bond, which had just sung a moment ago, snapped into a coil of paralyzing dread. You reek of nothing. The air left my lungs in a burning gasp. I swayed, bracing myself on the oak. Did you actually think it would be you? Daemon's scorn was icy. He took a deliberate, insulting step back. A wolf without power has no place in my bed. He didn't just reject me, he rejected the bond, the fates, and my very right to exist, all in one scathing sentence. The humiliation was immediate, white-hot, and suffocating. My cheeks flushed crimson, tears now streaming down my face, but I couldn't move. My knees were locked, my throat paralyzed. Daemon turned his back on me, leaving me utterly exposed to the pack's pity and contempt. He walked the few feet back to the circle, and this time, his eyes didn't pause. They went straight to Lysandra. The pain was only just beginning. Chapter 2. The air was so thick with tension it tasted like copper and ash. I could still feel the phantom weight of Damon's fingers on my hair, the cold dismissal in the way he'd tossed it away. Every single wolf in the shadow pack saw the raw, open wound of my rejection, and I couldn't even muster the strength to flee. My world had narrowed to the space between my useless feet and the root of the oak tree. The mate bond, which had briefly sung with the promise of belonging, was now a vicious, searing thing, tearing itself from my spirit with every beat of my heart. It felt like a phantom limb being slowly, agonizingly sawed off. Then, she moved. Lysandra didn't walk, she glided. She moved with the predatory confidence of a female who knew she was the prize. Her eyes, usually a soft honey color, were alight with unconcealed triumph as she passed me. She paused just long enough to let her gaze rake over my crumpled form. "Poor Elara," she murmured, loud enough for a cluster of nearby teens to hear, then sighed dramatically. "Such a shame the fates are so cruel to the weak." The cruelty wasn't the rejection. The cruelty was that she had orchestrated every moment leading up to it. She'd spent years poisoning the pack against me, subtly emphasizing my lack of spirit, my uselessness. She had always been the radiant one, and she would tolerate no competition, even from a wolf less shadow like me. Now, she stood before Damon. The alpha didn't even look back at me. His full, potent attention was reserved for Lysandra. He reached out and cupped her face, his thumb stroking her cheek in a gesture of possessive warmth that he had denied me moments before. "Lysandra," he rumbled, his voice now low and intimate, a stark contrast to the contempt he'd aimed at me. "The strength of my pack demands a strong Luna." He grabbed her hand and raised it high above their heads, drawing a collective roar from the assembled pack. "I choose her. Lysandra will stand at my side. She is my chosen mate." The sheer, unapologetic public claim was the final hammer blow. It didn't matter that the scent of the true mate bond had flared between Damon and me. He was choosing power over fate, prestige over destiny. And the pack would follow the power. The wolves began to cheer, a deafening sound that reverberated in my chest like a collapsing cavern. "Chosen." He called her his chosen mate. The physical pain of the bond snapping was joined by a searing, emotional agony. My vision tunneled. The celebratory bonfire light blurred into an ugly orange haze. The raw, guttural joy of the pack welcoming their new Luna was a sharp, vicious knife twisted deep in my heart. The rejection wasn't just losing a mate, it was losing my only anchor, my one chance at a future. I had been praying for a promised mate, dreaming of finally belonging, and instead, I had been publicly incinerated. I choked on a breath, tasting the dust on the ground. My legs gave out. I didn't cry out, because even that felt like an indulgence I wasn't allowed. I simply slid down the rough bark of the oak, an invisible girl folding in on herself, watching the man who had promised to be my salvation seal his bond with my tormentor. The scent of Damon's exhilaration, now inextricably mingled with Lysandra's perfume, was the last thing I smelled before the darkness, heavy and absolute, crashed over me. I was broken, and my wolf, the spirit that hadn't even had the decency to manifest, was already beginning its silent, agonizing withdrawal. Chapter 3. I woke up cold, then burning, then so cold again my teeth chattered. The rough, uneven floorboards of the shack the pack reserved for its least favored members scraped against my cheek. I hadn't made it past the front door of my pitiful home. I was curled in the fetal position, clinging to the only piece of comfort I possessed. A ragged, moth-eaten blanket. The pain was no longer a sharp, immediate knife wound. It was a slow, agonizing poison spreading through my blood. This wasn't a normal fever. This was rejection pain, a phenomenon unique to the snapped mate bond. It was my body fighting the absolute biological certainty that the person fated to complete me had violently thrown me away. Every nerve ending felt raw, screaming with the wrongness of it. I tried to sit up, but a wave of nausea and agonizing muscle cramps stole my breath. I collapsed back down, my head throbbing. It was like every cell in my body was weeping for the connection it had briefly known, the raw, beautiful surge of Damon's power meeting my own dormant spirit. Dormant. That was the real curse. Had my wolf manifested, perhaps Damon wouldn't have been so quick to cast me aside. I dragged myself into the corner, resting my hot forehead against the cool stone of the hearth. Even the rejection had a cruel, ironic twist. Rejection heat was supposed to be the body's aggressive attempt to seek out the rejected mate for a final, desperate physical claiming. An animalistic attempt to repair the break. But Damon wasn't coming. He was with Lysandra. The image of his hand cupping her face, his intimate rumbled voice, flashed behind my eyelids. A fresh wave of gut-wrenching grief hit me, and this time, it was accompanied by an overwhelming emptiness, the silence. I didn't have a wolf I could hear or feel, but I had always possessed a quiet, intuitive sense of the animal that should have been there. It was a potential, a promise of strength, a faint internal pulse. Now, there was nothing. The inner space where my spirit should have resided was cold, empty, and silent. My wolf, the one who never even bothered to manifest, had retreated. It was the ultimate betrayal. Even my own power had abandoned me in the face of my alpha's scorn. My wolf went silent. I squeezed my eyes shut, a desperate, silent plea slipping past my lips. Just let me fade. Let me stop feeling this. Suddenly, the door burst open. It wasn't a pack healer, or a concerned elder. It was my aunt, her face a mask of strained fury. She was Lysandra's mother, but she was also the sister of my deceased elemental wolf mother, and for a fleeting moment, I saw a terrifying flicker of protectiveness in her eyes that was entirely for me. She didn't offer a hug or comforting words. She was too practical, too cold for that. Get up, Elara, she commanded, her voice low and urgent. You can't lie here like this. This heat will kill you if the grief doesn't first. She was dragging me to my feet, her hands surprisingly strong. When she paused, her eyes locking onto the angry, red bruising that had bloomed across my shoulders and collarbones from the shock of the bond snapping. He truly rejected you, she whispered, a strange mix of guilt and rage crossing her features. He chose that spoiled brat over the elemental bloodline. Then, a cold, calculated fire ignited in her eyes. It wasn't pity. It was the rage of a mother who saw her own daughter being celebrated on a foundation of lies. She saw the true, destined Luna lying broken on the floor while her selfish child paraded a forged promise. The aunt reached into the deep pocket of her travel cloak, her hand closing around something small, cold, and heavy. No, she muttered, the sound a low, definitive growl. I won't let her ruin this destiny too. A storm was brewing, and the rejection was merely the beginning. Chapter 4. The rage in my aunt's eyes was a cold, sharp thing, nothing like the furious heartbreak that consumed me. It was the calculated fury of a woman scorned, a woman who saw her own ambition and position undermined by her daughter's reckless vanity. She looked from the bruised marks on my skin, the physical manifestation of Damon's rejection, to the corner of the room where a small, carved wooden box sat on a dusty shelf. It was the box that held the elemental seal, the artifact that represented my dead mother's power and my rightful heritage, though I had never been allowed to touch it. Lysandra parades a lie, my aunt spat, her voice tight with venom. She has been flaunting that forged piece of metal for weeks, convincing Damon she has the true power, and now he crowns her for it. The fool. I tried to speak, but only a dry, rattling cough escaped my throat. The rejection fever was intensifying, making my limbs feel heavy and disconnected. Your mother entrusted me with this, she whispered, her eyes dark and distant, lost in a memory. She was referring to the promise she'd made to her sister years ago, a promise to protect the elemental bloodline. I swore I'd protect the power, not let it fall into the hands of the power-hungry. She marched to the shelf, the movement swift and determined. She took the small, unassuming wooden box. Inside, resting on faded velvet, was the real elemental seal. It wasn't flashy or ornate like the one Lysandra wore. It was a simple, ancient-looking piece of obsidian, dull and dark until it caught the light, when a faint, deep red glow could be glimpsed deep within its core. A strange, familiar ache pulsed in my palm when she held it, a distant echo of the power I was denied. My aunt tucked the true seal carefully into an inner pocket of her traveling cloak. Then, her movements became even more frantic, more focused. She crossed the room to an old chest, rummaging until she pulled out a piece of polished brass that looked vaguely like the seal, a crude forgery made for show. Lysandra had been carrying it openly for months to solidify her fake claim. She chose greed. She chose to steal your destiny, Elara, my aunt growled, her focus solely on the twin objects in her hands. Her cruelty toward me over the years was momentarily eclipsed by her blinding rage at her own daughter's selfish ambition. She was deciding to save me, not out of love, but out of a fierce, protective loyalty to the power and a bitter desire for revenge against the one who had so publicly embarrassed her, her own daughter. She looked at the small brass forgery, then back at the true obsidian artifact, a cold, calculated decision settling over her face. She can have her fake crown, but she won't have the power to keep it. In that moment, she wasn't just my aunt, she was the guardian of a terrifying secret, finally choosing a side. And that side was not her own daughter's. She was determined to save her niece's future, and guarantee her own daughter's catastrophic fall. She snatched up a small bag, already packed with essentials for travel. She looked down at me, her expression hardening. Get up, Elara. We're leaving. Now. Before that narcissistic child realizes what she's truly lost. The betrayal was finished, but the retribution was just beginning. The decision to steal the real seal had been made. We were now running from a scorned Alpha and a vicious, fake Luna. Chapter 5. My aunt's hands moved with practiced, chilling efficiency. While I lay shivering, consumed by the agonizing throes of the rejection heat, she was finalizing the act of supreme betrayal against her own daughter. She retrieved the true, obsidian elemental seal from the traveling cloak pocket and placed it carefully inside the rough linen bag she'd set aside. The true destiny was secured. Then, with an almost surgical precision, she moved to the small, decorative vanity Lysandra had left at our meager dwelling, a showy display of wealth she shouldn't have been allowed. My aunt retrieved the small, decorative wooden box she had taken the real seal from moments ago. From her sleeve, she pulled the cheap, heavy brass forgery Lysandra had been carrying as a prop. The one the pack believed to be the real thing. The one Lysandra had used to convince Damon of her power. With a definitive, chilling click, she sealed the worthless brass imitation inside the ancient wooden box. There, my aunt stated, her voice devoid of emotion, her eyes focused on the box as if it were a bomb she had just disarmed. Let her celebrate her false Luna status. Let her wear the forged crown and believe she holds the power. The act of the switch was complete. My aunt had not only stolen my birthright back, but she had set a ticking time bomb under her own daughter's reign. She turned to me, her eyes finally softening, though it was still a hard, calculating kind of pity. She knelt, checking the fever on my brow. You have the true power with you now, Elara, though you may not realize it yet, she murmured, the words sounding like an echo of the promise she'd made to my mother. You will be weak for weeks. The bond break is dangerous, but you must fight this. The Alpha Lord's lands are far, and we will face dangers even before we cross the border. She reached inside the linen bag, pulling out the genuine, dull obsidian seal. It wasn't meant to be handled by the unawakened, but she needed to secure it to me. She threaded a thin leather cord through the seal's carved loop and placed it around my neck. The moment the obsidian rested against my skin, directly over my still, broken heart, a strange thing happened. The raw, throbbing agony of the rejection didn't vanish, but the sharp, shivering edge of the fever instantly dulled. It was like an anchor had dropped inside the storm. The seal was cool against my burning skin, a silent, comforting weight. It didn't pulse with power, but it felt right. It felt like a missing piece clicking into place. My aunt watched the reaction with a satisfied, almost fearful nod. The blood remembers, she breathed. She helped me to my feet, bracing my weak frame against her own. Every step was pure agony. My muscles screamed, my head spun, and my wolf was still a terrifying, empty silence. We leave now, she insisted, pushing the rag in my hand. Wipe the tears, child. They already believe you are pathetic. Do not give them the satisfaction of seeing you ruined. Her words were harsh, but they were the only thing that cut through the haze of my pain. They forced a flicker of defiance back into my spirit. I was rejected. I was broken, but I was not pathetic. Leaning heavily on the only person left to me, the unlikely betrayer who was now my sole protector, I took the first agonizing step toward the door. We were fleeing the pack that had scorned me, carrying the secret that could destroy it. The vow to protect her niece's future had been sealed, and our escape had just begun. Absolutely. Time for the agonizing, desperate journey that solidifies the rejection and pushes the FMC toward her ruthless king. Chapter 6. The night was a vast, unforgiving black blanket, offering cover but no comfort. Every step I took was a vicious protest from my body. The rejection fever hadn't broken, it had just been muted by the cool presence of the elemental seal resting against my chest. But the physical trauma of the snapped mate bond was relentless. I was leaning almost fully on my aunt, her strong, hurried pace barely slowing for my weakness. She had swapped her fine clothes for practical, dark traveling gear, her expression grimly set on the horizon. Faster, Elara, she hissed, her eyes constantly darting into the shadows. If Lysandra finds that fake seal before dawn, she'll run straight to Damon, and they'll have the whole pack on us. The fear in her voice was the only thing sharper than the pain in my limbs. I pushed through the waves of nausea and cramping, trying to mimic her focused speed. Damon. The memory of his cold eyes and sneering mouth was a constant, stinging presence. But worse than the disdain was the phantom sensation that haunted me, the brief, terrifying moment of the mate bond recognition. As we stumbled through the dense forest, my mind replayed the scene, not the rejection, but the instant before it. I remembered the fierce, possessive pull, the dizzying certainty that he was mine. The bond had been real, and that made the rejection even more monstrous. He had felt the truth of the connection and ruthlessly chosen to deny it, to shatter it for the sake of power and pride. We moved in absolute silence, the only sound the crunch of leaves under our worn boots. The forest, which should have felt comforting, was now alive with danger. Every rustle of leaves sounded like a pursuing wolf. We reached the Alpha Lord's border, the line we had to cross to truly be safe, after what felt like an eternity. The border was marked by an unnaturally still river, the water black and sluggish under the moon. My aunt halted abruptly, her breath catching. "The scent ward is strong here," she whispered. "This lord, he does not play games. We must cross quickly." But as we neared the riverbank, an entirely new sensation hit me, one that blew past the agony of Damon's rejection and hammered straight into my core. It was a scent, cedar, smoke, and pure, raw dominance. It wasn't the pack-familiar scent of Damon, but something infinitely deeper, older, and more commanding. It was a terrifying, potent pressure that didn't just register in my nose, it registered in my blood. My wolf, the silent coward who had abandoned me, felt a faint, frantic stirring. My head swam. I nearly fainted, not from exhaustion, but from a sudden, overwhelming, and utterly confusing biological certainty. My body, still reeling from the violent detachment of one soul bond, was instantly responding to the powerful, magnetic pull of another male. My breath hitched. My eyes darted around, searching the opposite bank of the river. What was that? This new pull was not gentle or hopeful like the one I'd prayed for with Damon. This scent, this awareness, was the cold, unyielding scent of destiny, infused with possessive power. I clutched the seal at my neck, fighting the dizziness. "Elara, we must go. Now," my aunt urged, grabbing my arm and practically dragging me into the icy water. The moment the frigid water hit my skin, the overpowering foreign scent seemed to intensify, wrapping around me like a physical blanket of heat. It was a promise and a warning. I was escaping one monster, only to crash directly into the territory of a king whose claim, I could already sense, would be absolute. The rejection had left me empty, but the bond pull of another wolf had just begun to stir, filling the void with a terrifying new potential. We scrambled onto the king's side of the river, soaked and shivering. I didn't look back at the pack I had lost. I was looking forward, straight into the formidable, dangerous arms of the unknown. Chapter 7. The river crossing hadn't given us rest, it had only plunged us deeper into the territory of the Alpha Lord. My aunt, galvanized by the immediate need for protection, practically dragged me up the muddy embankment and along a barely visible path. The crushing exhaustion of the rejection heat made my mind cloudy, but that intense, primal scent, cedar, smoke, and sheer, demanding power, was a blazing beacon, pulling me forward even as my own body failed. We traveled for what seemed like hours, eventually emerging from the wild lands onto a paved road leading to a city that rose from the earth like a fortress carved from obsidian. This was not the rustic, familiar architecture of my former pack. This was a seat of ancient power, cold, black, and formidable. Guards, taller and broader than any I'd ever seen, met us at the city gates. They moved with a terrifying economy of motion. My aunt, pulling herself up to her full height, spoke the password, a hushed name I didn't recognize, and explained, with a chilling lack of detail, that she was seeking sanctuary for the elemental bloodline. We were escorted through labyrinthine halls, past nobles whose stares were knives, sharp, assessing, and utterly dismissive of the soaked, broken girl leaning on her older protector. Finally, we reached the heart of the fortress, the throne room. It was vast, high-ceilinged, and terrifyingly silent. The only source of light came from towering braziers that cast dancing, intimidating shadows. At the far end, dominating the room, was the throne, a massive, dark relic that looked as if it had been forged in a volcano. And on it, sat the king. The moment I saw him, the last vestiges of my strength fled. I stopped dead, my feverish gaze locked on him. He was the source of that overwhelming scent, that magnetic, terrifying pull. He was raw, untamed authority given flesh. His hair was black, scraped back from a forehead set in a perpetual scowl of command. His shoulders were wide, draped in black furs, and the hand gripping the armrest was corded with muscle. Everything about him screamed danger, finality, and absolute, undisputed rule. This was King Valen, the Alpha Lord. He did not smile. He did not move. He simply observed us with eyes the color of molten silver, eyes that cut through my humiliation, my weakness, and my tattered disguise. And then, it happened. The intense, debilitating pain of Damon's rejection, which had been a constant companion, abruptly went quiet. In its place, the magnetic pull I'd felt at the riverbank snapped into a full-force mate-bond connection. It was instantaneous, ferocious, and demanding. It wasn't the tentative, hopeful flash I'd felt with Damon. This was a possessive, soul-deep tether that felt like a bolt of lightning had been slammed directly into my chest, leaving me breathless and dizzy. King Valen slowly, deliberately rose from his throne. The sound of his movements was deafening in the silence. His silver eyes didn't leave mine as he descended the 3 steps, moving with the unhurried grace of a predator who knew his prey could never escape. He stopped 10 feet away. His scent, cedar, smoke, and primal male, was so thick it felt like I was breathing him in, filling my lungs with his power. He lowered his head slightly, his gaze dropping from my eyes to the obsidian seal clutched at my throat, then back up to meet my terrified stare. His voice was a deep, gravelly sound, the first thing he'd uttered. It was a simple statement of devastating possession, a decree that echoed the sudden, frantic certainty thrumming in my blood. My bride has returned. The words weren't a question or an invitation. They were a king's claim. I had fled a weak mate's rejection only to walk straight into the iron grip of a powerful, ruthless king who saw not a broken girl, but his long-awaited destiny. The king has spoken, but what will the court say to his bride? We have a king's claim, now we need the reaction. The court is not happy about this drenched, broken girl being declared their queen. Chapter 8. The silence in the throne room was heavier than any weapon. It was the absolute pause before thunder. King Valen didn't wait for my response, or for the gasps of his court to subside. He closed the remaining distance between us in 2 predator-like strides. My aunt, sensing the terrifying shift in power, instinctively stepped back, leaving me exposed and reeling from the double shock of a rejected bond and an accepted one. He didn't touch me gently. He seized my wrist, his fingers wrapping around my thin bone with a possessiveness that was bone deep. His skin was hot against mine, and the jolt of our physical connection sent a searing wave of new mate bond recognition through my entire system. Where Damon's bond had felt like a hopeful, fragile thread, Valen's was an iron chain forged in the Earth's core. It didn't just mend the hole Damon left, it consumed the space, demanding absolute compliance. This is mine, Valen growled, not to me, but to the room. His voice was a whip crack of command, pure, primal Alpha Lord authority. He didn't say my name. He didn't need to. I was a declaration, a prize, an artifact he had just laid claim to. My breath hitched. The heat from his touch was intoxicating, a drug that instantly began to fight the crippling chills of the rejection fever. The mate bond flared, a blinding, intoxicating rush of raw power and rightness. It felt dangerous, terrifying, but indisputably fated. Valen turned his blazing silver eyes toward his gathered nobles, a crowd of powerful, stiffly regal wolves whose expressions ranged from confusion to outright hostility. He lifted our joined hands, displaying me like a trophy. She carries the seal, and she carries my bond. She is ours. His statement elicited a collective, low murmur of protest from the floor. I could feel the invisible knives of their judgment piercing me. I was wolf-less, dripping river water onto their polished floors, and clearly in the throes of fever. Your Grace, began a towering duke, his voice slick with veiled contempt. Forgive my query, but this female, she is clearly weak, and unshifted. We need the elemental power now more than ever, not a... He paused, searching for the most damning word. Burden. The word, burden, snapped the last of my fragile composure. My head bowed in shame, confirming their assessment. But then, King Valen's power filled the room, silencing the Duke mid-sentence. He didn't yell. He simply tightened his grip on my wrist and looked at the Duke with an expression that promised a swift, agonizing death. Look closer, old wolf, Valen commanded. He drew me closer to his side, the heat of his body practically searing my damp cloak. He didn't release my wrist, but instead, with the thumb of his other hand, he delicately brushed the skin just beneath my ear. The touch was possessive, a shocking, intimate caress in front of his entire kingdom. The bond pull intensified to an almost unbearable level. A wave of uncontrollable heat lingered in the space between us, so strong I felt dizzy, and I had to clutch at the fabric of his dark tunic to remain upright. Her strength is mine, Valen growled, his voice dipping low, a threat disguised as a vow. And her connection is absolute. The fates have brought her across the river, half dead, to stand where she belongs. He was declaring our bond, our destiny, over the practical, political protests of his court. He was claiming me not despite my weakness, but with a terrifying confidence that he was the only power I would ever need. Chapter 9. The silence was broken not by a roar of approval, but by a cascade of low, bitter mutters that rippled through the gathered court. Every eye was a silver shard of contempt, focused solely on me. I was still clutching King Valen's tunic, his body heat the only thing keeping the crushing shame at bay. The murmurs quickly coalesced into open, hushed protests. She's wolf-less. A gnoll, hissed a regal-looking woman whose scent was thick with alpha lineage. Unworthy of the Lord's bed, let alone the throne, another agreed, his voice dripping scorn. We are on the brink of war. We need the elemental fire, not a weak human girl. The words struck with brutal accuracy, confirming every fear and humiliation I had ever internalized. They mocked me as wolf-less, unworthy of their king. My own heart echoed their sentiment. How could this terrifying, magnificent male truly want me, the girl Damon had discarded for lack of power? I tried to pull my wrist free of Valen's iron grasp, desperate to sink to the floor and disappear, but his grip only tightened, a silent warning. Valen remained absolutely motionless, a statue of deadly calm amidst the rising tide of dissent. His silver eyes scanned the faces of his nobles, not with anger, but with an unnerving, icy patience. He was letting them speak, allowing them to hang themselves with their own disrespect. The Duke who had first spoken stepped forward again, bolder now, driven by the collective disapproval. Your Grace, he pressed, bowing low, but his voice was firm. The elementals are a vital ally. We cannot risk the balance of power on an unproven female who carries the scent of a rejected bond. Surely, this connection, this fever, is a trick of fate, an illusion born of her weakness. The accusation of the rejection being a trick, a contagion, made my stomach clench. It was true, I was still reeling from Damon's severing, and here I was, claiming to be the destined mate of a king. Valen finally spoke, his voice dropping dangerously low, forcing the entire room to strain to hear him, making his authority absolute. A trick? He challenged. He turned his head slightly, his gaze meeting mine. In that moment, the raw, demanding energy of the new bond flared between us, a dazzling, terrifying explosion of certainty that only we could truly feel. He didn't release my wrist. Instead, he slipped his other arm around my waist, pulling my bruised and fevered body flush against his hard, warm side. The gesture was more than possessive, it was a physical vow that dismissed every whisper in the room. "I need no counsel on what is mine," he stated, his eyes locking onto the Duke. "The fates do not make mistakes. She is the carrier of the bloodline, and she is bound to the lord of this domain." His words did little to soothe the whispers, but they silenced the open defiance. The nobles knew the price of questioning their king. I was his now, a damaged, fragile pawn in a game I didn't understand. Yet, clinging to his side, feeling the undeniable, electric connection that dwarfed the memory of Damon's weak touch, I realized one terrifying truth. He didn't care about my weakness. He only cared that I was his. And his possession was absolute. Chapter 10. The atmosphere in the throne room was volatile, thick with the scent of fear and thinly veiled disrespect. The nobles, accustomed to political maneuvering, waited for King Valen to offer a concession, a promise to test me, to prove I was worthy. They expected him to protect his reputation. Valen did the opposite. He kept his arm locked around my waist, his heat a scorching, undeniable force against my trembling body. His gaze, those terrifying molten silver eyes, swept over the most vocal detractors, the Duke, the alpha female, the elders, before settling on the floor, directly in front of his obsidian throne. A hush fell, more absolute than before. Everyone braced for the king's brutal decree, an exile, a challenge, or perhaps even an execution. Instead, the Alpha Lord performed an act that shattered the political foundation of his court and cemented my place at his side, not as a prize, but as a destined equal. Slowly, deliberately, King Valen knelt. His massive frame lowered to one knee, the movement radiating power, not submission. He knelt on the cold stone floor, right in front of the tattered, pathetic, fever-racked girl they had just dismissed as unworthy. A collective, audible gasp ripped through the hall. Kings did not kneel to anyone but their gods. He reached up, his gaze never leaving my own. He didn't touch my waist or my hand. He gently, almost reverently, placed his thumb and forefinger beneath the obsidian seal resting on my collarbone. "You look for the power." Valen's voice was a low, dangerous rumble that cut through the silence. "You seek the flames, the fury, the strength that defends the border." His eyes, still locked on mine, were blazing with a certainty that silenced every political doubt. "I don't need her power. I only need her." The sheer, possessive arrogance of the statement was breathtaking. He was telling them that his rule was so absolute, his power so complete, that he didn't require the elemental strength to defend his kingdom. He required me, the vessel, the mate, the queen, because the fates decreed it and he accepted it. The bond tension between us was a screaming, physical entity. My heart hammered against my ribs, and the rejection fever that had plagued me for days seemed to momentarily vanish, incinerated by the demanding heat of his declaration. His heavy stare burrowed into my soul, communicating a raw, possessive devotion that felt terrifying and utterly right. He stayed kneeling, a dark monarch bowed before his supposed weakling mate, until every wolf in the room dropped their eyes. They had been told, with an act that spoke louder than any threat, "She is mine, and her value is measured by my decree, not your judgment." The political debate was over. The king had claimed his bride, and the challenge had cost his nobles their standing. I was the queen of a ruthless king who had just knelt before me. The true danger was just beginning. Chapter 11. The kneeling had ended the open defiance, but it had started something far more potent, an escalating, agonizing awareness between King Valen and me. The court was dismissed, but the tension he'd created followed us into the heart of the fortress. My rejection fever was gone, replaced by a devastating, continuous wave of heat that had nothing to do with illness and everything to do with the overwhelming presence of my new mate. It wasn't the slow, building warmth of courtship, it was an uncontrolled, agonizing internal bonfire. This was the raw reality of being soul-bound to a true Alpha Lord. Every time he was near, my body flared in an uncontrollable, desperate craving. We were in the grand hall, preparing for a sparse dinner. Valen was speaking with his general about border patrols, his voice calm, commanding, and utterly distracting. I was supposed to be listening, absorbing the politics, but I could barely focus past the frantic thrumming in my veins. He was only 5 feet away, and the air between us felt charged, thick, and demanding. My hands were shaking. I wanted to close the distance, to rub myself against the thick fur of his cloak, to absorb the intoxicating cedar and smoke scent that promised safety and ruin. He must have felt the intense spiral of my need. He stopped speaking mid-sentence and turned his molten silver eyes on me. They weren't angry, but dark with a heavy, possessive hunger. "Elara," he stated, his voice a low thrum that sent a shocking bolt of electricity straight to my core. I didn't answer. I just stood there, breathing too quickly, a deer caught in his predatory gaze. Valen dismissed the general with a curt wave, closing the 5 feet between us with a terrifying grace. He didn't rush. Every movement was deliberate, commanding. He didn't touch me where anyone could see. Instead, he leaned in, his powerful body hovering over mine, stealing my air. "You're burning up, little wolf," he murmured, the use of the nickname, a direct acknowledgement of my suppressed power making my knees weak. "It's the bond," I managed, the words catching in my throat. "I feel too much." He didn't disagree. He didn't offer comfort. He offered a test. His large hand rose slowly, deliberately, until it reached my face. His fingers were calloused, strong, and terrifyingly gentle. He didn't stroke my cheek. He teased, his thumb hovering just beneath my jawline, brushing the soft, pulse-point skin with a feather-light friction. He teases, brushing her jaw with his thumb. The minimal contact was an explosion. The localized heat where his thumb brushed me instantly spread through my body like wildfire. I gasped, unable to suppress the sharp intake of breath. The air around us felt thin, laced with our combined, volatile pheromones. "Good," he growled, the sound vibrating through the air between us. "You need to get used to feeling too much. I will not shield you from my presence, mate." His silver eyes dropped to my mouth, and for a terrifying second, I thought he was going to consume me right there in the hall. My body arched infinitesimally toward him, pleading for release from the agonizing buildup. I felt an uncontrollable craving that dwarfed every romantic notion I'd ever harbored for Damon. This was primal, dangerous, and absolutely real. He took his hand away, the sudden loss of contact leaving me reeling. "Control it, Queen," he ordered, his voice suddenly sharp, snapping me back from the brink of collapse. "You are mine, and every noble in this castle can smell it. Learn to wear my scent without burning down the room." He turned and continued his walk toward the dining area, leaving me pressed against the wall, panting, humiliated, and utterly desperate. The heat in the halls wasn't just a political problem, it was an agonizing, intimate war, and I was losing the battle for control. I was bound to a man whose mere proximity threatened to strip me bare. Chapter 12. While I struggled to control the searing, demanding bond heat inside the obsidian fortress, back in the Shadowpack's desolate camp, Lysandra was unraveling. The initial, giddy triumph of becoming Alpha Damon's chosen Luna had curdled into a bitter paranoia. She wore the forged brass seal, the fake that my aunt had swapped, like a crown, but it offered no actual power, only a growing fear of exposure. The true, ancient power was missing, and the Alpha Lord's sudden, shocking claim of Elara had reached their ears with alarming speed. News traveled fast across the borders, carried by spies and resentful whispers. The Alpha Lord, King Valen, had not just taken me in, he had knelt before me. He had declared a wolf-less girl his bride. Lysandra's blood ran cold. The girl she'd spent years erasing, the girl she'd scorned, was now wearing the royal scent of the most powerful wolf in the Northern Territories. This wasn't just about an alpha, this was about a king. "It can't be true," Lysandra hissed to Damon, pacing the floor of their shared chamber. Her perfect composure was cracking, revealing the volatile insecurity beneath. "She is a null. She's lying. She stole the seal before fleeing, and she tricked that brute of a king into taking her." Damon, still reeling from the political embarrassment of having rejected the true elemental bloodline, was defensive and furious. "The scent of the Alpha Lord is not something a pack wolf can simply trick," he snarled, though his regret was already a poisonous cloud around him. He'd chosen a flashy lie over true destiny. But Lysandra didn't care about his regret. She only cared about her coveted status. She clutched the heavy, worthless brass seal at her neck, her eyes blazing with determination. The cousin's jealousy had reached its fever pitch, twisting into a poisonous obsession. She wasn't just jealous of the mate bond, she was jealous of the power, the throne, and the sudden, irreversible elevation of the girl she despised. He calls her his queen, Lysandra whispered, the venom clear in her voice. He will give her everything that should be mine. The wealth, the power, the respect. I will not allow it. She knew that if Elara was truly accepted and crowned, not only would her own claim as Luna crumble, but the entire Shadow Pack would become a joke, ruled by a man who rejected his fated mate for a fraud. Her cunning, however, had one advantage. She still had the loyalty of her mate, Daemon. We go to him, she declared, slamming her hand down on a table, the fragile stability of their new union cracking under the pressure. We expose her. We reveal that she is wolf-less and a thief. We will march into that palace, and we will demand the truth of the seal be revealed. Daemon, fueled by his own simmering shame and the desire to expose Valen as a fool for claiming damaged goods, readily agreed. The Alpha Lord's claim on me was an insult to his own poor judgment. Lysandra rages, determined to reclaim her place. She didn't have the king's scent, or the real seal, but she had a forged story and a powerful, rejected alpha on her arm. The confrontation was set. They would not wait for diplomacy. They would arrive with their accusations ready, believing that a little political pressure and the scent of my weakness would be enough to break the king's claim. Chapter 13. The tension in King Valen's court had been simmering for 3 days, fueled by the king's absolute refusal to present me, his supposed queen, for any formal vetting. Instead, he treated me as a closely guarded secret, keeping me secluded, allowing only brief, agonizingly intimate moments where the uncontrolled bond heat flared between us. It was during one such moment, Valen was reviewing maps, and I was desperately trying to focus on a book while sitting dangerously close to him, that the tranquility was shattered. The air in the stone fortress didn't just shift, it ripped open. A wave of aggressive, familiar alpha scent flooded the hallways, a scent laced with arrogance and desperate challenge. It was Daemon, and his presence was a direct insult to the Alpha Lord's domain. I shot to my feet, the blood draining from my face. I recognized the scent, the power, and the terrifying, humiliating memories it conjured. My old Alpha was here, and he wasn't alone. Valen rose slowly from his seat, his silver eyes cold and lethal. He hadn't needed the scent to know the trespasser. His guards had already been warned. He looked at me, a low growl rumbling deep in his chest. He shouldn't have come, Valen murmured, his hand settling possessively on my lower back. The simple touch was a clear claim, a silent reminder that my old life was over. Your Grace, they demand audience, announced the captain of the guard, his voice tight. The former Alpha Daemon, accompanied by his Luna, Lysandra. They claim the female in your possession is a thief and an impostor of the elemental line. A bitter, sick feeling twisted in my stomach. The humiliation wasn't just coming back, it was storming the castle doors. Valen's eyes hardened. He didn't waste time on debate. He simply pulled me against his side, forcing me to walk with him, exposed, to face the confrontation. We walked into the main audience chamber, where Daemon and Lysandra stood flanked by 2 of their toughest-looking beta wolves. Daemon was posturing, trying to project the kind of alpha dominance that would impress the Lord's court. Lysandra, despite her carefully controlled expression, looked savage with triumph and barely restrained fury. She saw me, taller, cleaner, draped in a simple but fine gown gifted by Valen, and most damningly, standing intimately at the king's side. Her honey eyes narrowed into slits of pure hatred. Daemon's gaze, however, was different. It lingered on my figure, on the way Valen's hand rested so naturally on my waist. For the first time, I saw a flicker of doubt and regret in his storm cloud eyes. He saw the undeniable, electric connection between Valen and me. A connection he had foolishly, short-sightedly rejected. Lysandra didn't wait. She thrust her chin out and pointed a perfectly manicured finger at me. There she is, my king, she spat, addressing Valen with false respect. A thief, a wolf-less fraud, and a liar. She stole the elemental seal and manipulated her way into your sanctuary. I, Lysandra, am the true Luna, the one chosen to carry the elemental legacy. She gestured dramatically to the forged brass seal around her neck, its dull shine a pitiful contrast to the quiet power I felt radiating from the real obsidian against my own skin. The Alpha and his chosen Luna march in, demanding Elara be exposed as a fraud. Valen simply stared at them, his silver eyes radiating such cold contempt that even Damon seemed to shrink a fraction. He tightened his grip on me, pulling me impossibly closer until the side of my head rested against his thick, muscled shoulder. Is that so? Valen's voice was perilously soft. He didn't release me. He didn't even look at me for confirmation. He was waiting for them to finish their pathetic display, reserving his devastating rebuttal for the moment of maximum political effect. The courtroom clash was officially on. Chapter 14. The atmosphere in King Valen's audience chamber was glacial. The court, eager for drama and validation of their doubts, leaned in, their eyes darting between the Shadow Pack delegation and the king's intensely possessive hold on me. Lyssandra's voice was high and shrill, fueled by a jealous rage that drowned out any sense of self-preservation. She doesn't even shift. She is a known null. The elemental power, the true fire, would never bond to such a weakness. She has fooled you, your grace, with a stolen trinket and a pitiful act. She yanked the heavy brass seal from her neck, holding the crude forgery up to the light. I am the one with power, the one who deserves the bond. Damon, standing beside her, looked less certain, his gaze still fixed on the undeniable connection radiating from Valen and me. The powerful, magnetic scent of our bond was a silent rebuke to his own poor judgment. Yet, pride was a deadly thing. He stepped forward, putting his alpha authority behind his chosen Luna. We merely ask that the female be subjected to the elemental trial, Damon said, his voice calmer, aimed at appealing to the court's sense of fairness. If she is truly the heir, the seal will obey her. If she is a fraud, it will expose her. I felt the court's agreement. This was reasonable. This was the only way to settle the matter. My heart pounded a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I knew the obsidian seal around my neck was real. I could feel the faint, quiet hum of its power keeping the rejection pain at bay. But I was still wolf-less. I hadn't shifted. I hadn't summoned a single spark of elemental fire. What if the seal required a manifested wolf to acknowledge its owner? The sheer pressure of the scrutiny was crippling. Damon, the man who had torn my heart out, was demanding I be stripped naked and tested. I shook under pressure, the shame and the exhaustion overwhelming me. Valen felt the tremor in my body. His hand, which had been resting on my waist, shifted. His large, warm fingers splayed over my stomach, a gesture of intensely possessive comfort. He didn't look at me. His molten silver eyes remained fixed on Damon and Lysandra. You dare bring your internal pack squabbles and your weak alpha's mistakes into my court, Valen growled, the sound low and dangerous. You rejected her, Alpha. That was your failure, not the fates. I accepted her, and that is my final word. Lysandra, seeing her opportunity slipping away, turned her vitriol directly toward me. Look at her, King. She shakes like a fawn. A queen should have fire in her blood, not tears. She stole the elemental seal and you are a fool for trusting a null over true blood. Valen took a deep, terrifying breath, the silence stretching taut across the room. He was a volcano about to erupt. But before he could unleash the king's fury, my aunt stepped forward from the shadows near the entrance, her expression grim and resolute. She was prepared to complete her vow of protection and unleash her own brand of vengeance. The climax was imminent. Chapter 15. The air was electric, charged with the volatile sense of jealousy, fear, and unchecked alpha dominance. Lysandra's final, venomous accusation, that I was a tearful fraud and a null, was the catalyst. King Valen's composure, which had been stretched taut, finally snapped. The hand resting on my waist instantly shifted into a crushing grip that momentarily stole my breath, not out of aggression toward me, but out of the sheer force of his escalating rage. He shoved me gently but firmly behind his broad back, stepping forward to shield me completely from the venomous pair. Valen's silver eyes were no longer molten, they were flat sheets of cold, terrifying metal. His body language was a direct threat. He was the apex predator, cornering the insolent pack wolves who had dared to trespass and insult his claim. His voice, when it came, was a low, terrifying growl that seemed to vibrate the very stone columns of the hall. Say one more word against my mate and I'll gut you here. The threat was not a formality, it was a promise. The two Shadow Pack betas flanking Damon instantly recoiled, their knees buckling under the pure, lethal force of the Alpha Lord's dominance. Damon, for the first time since his arrival, looked genuinely terrified. He realized he hadn't challenged a rival Alpha, he had committed a capital offense against a reigning king. Lysandra, blinded by her monumental rage and belief in her own rightful status, tried to sputter a protest. But the seal, the bloodline. Silence. Valen roared, the sound echoing off the high ceilings. I have heard enough of your pathetic whining and baseless claims. He gestured sharply to my aunt, who had been standing at the edge of the chamber, waiting for her moment. You brought this matter before my court. Now, you will hear the truth from the only one with the authority to reveal it. My aunt stepped forward, her face etched with a mix of grim determination and sorrow. She faced her own daughter, Lysandra, with a heavy heart, but her loyalty to the elemental legacy, and her revenge for my broken spirit, was stronger. Your Grace, King Valen, and all nobles of the realm, my aunt began, her voice steady despite the tension. She gestured toward Lysandra, who was still clutching the fake brass seal. My daughter, Lysandra, has been parading a lie. The seal she wears is a forgery, a crude piece of brass made to grant her status she did not earn. She coveted the power and used this deception to manipulate Alpha Damon into rejecting his true mate. Lysandra let out a strangled cry of outrage. Mother, you lie, you treasonous. I have the proof, my child, my aunt cut in, her voice ringing with finality. She pointed to me, where I stood shielded by the king. My niece, Elara, possesses the true seal, given to me by my sister, the last elemental wolf, to protect. The true heir is Elara. The king's fury had cleared the path for the ultimate, devastating reveal. The lies were exposed, and the truth, though terrifying, finally stood center stage. Chapter 16. The silence following my aunt's revelation was absolute. Every eye, including King Valen's, snapped back to the two objects in question. The glittering brass seal around Lysandra's neck and the dull, unassuming obsidian hanging against my chest. Lysandra's composure finally shattered. She launched herself forward, screaming in high-pitched denial, her face twisted with a terrifying blend of panic and rage. She lies. This is an ancient betrayal. Mother, you promised. The shame is hers. She is wolf-less. Damon, tell them. She's a thief. Damon stood paralyzed, his eyes wide with the devastating realization that the woman he had just crowned his Luna was a public fraud, and the woman he had scorned was the true, powerful destiny he'd forfeited. Valen remained a solid wall of power, but his attention was fixed on my aunt, waiting for the definitive proof. My aunt, cold and resolute, ignored her daughter's hysterical pleas. She turned to the captain of the guard. Bring me a basin of pure water, and a drop of the elemental blood. A guard immediately brought the supplies. My aunt pricked her own finger, the blood of the sister still running through her veins, and let a single drop fall onto the surface of the basin's water. The water remained clear. This is how the true power is acknowledged, she explained to the court, her voice carrying the weight of ancient law. She then directed a guard to approach me. I was still trembling under the intense scrutiny, but Valen's hand on my back was an anchor. The guard gently sliced my palm, the faintest of cuts, and my blood, still hot with Valen's bond heat, welled up. The instant Elara's blood hit the water, the surface didn't just ripple, it ignited. A brief, searing flash of intense red and orange fire blossomed on the surface before settling into a deep, vibrant swirl that slowly dissipated. A collective gasp went up from the court. The test was undeniable. Elemental blood had reacted. My aunt then marched toward her daughter. Lysandra, screaming obscenities and trying to twist away, was held in place by a powerful beta. Prove your worth, Lysandra. Show them the fire. My aunt challenged, her face wet with her own conflicted tears. Lysandra clutched the brass seal, her breathing ragged. She focused all her hatred and will onto the object, attempting to force a reaction, to conjure the slightest spark. But nothing happened. The brass remained cold, dull, and utterly lifeless. My aunt seized the fraudulent seal and, with a vicious snarl of betrayal, snapped it off her daughter's neck. She held the brass object high above her head and simply dropped it onto the stone floor. It didn't shatter, it didn't ignite. It hit the floor with a pathetic clank and then, under the sheer, pure power of the elementals now present, the soft metal crumbled in her hands, dissolving into a pile of worthless, oxidized dust. The physical decay of the forgery was the final proof. The cousin was unmasked. Lysandra didn't scream anymore. She let out a whimpering cry of utter defeat, realizing that the lie that defined her had just been destroyed by her own mother. The silence that followed was complete, broken only by King Valen's deep, satisfied exhale behind me. The political battle had been won. Chapter 17. The dust of the crumbled forgery was all that remained of Lysandra's claim, and King Valen's silver eyes were fixed on the perpetrator. There was no pity in his expression, only the cold, unyielding judgment of a monarch whose time had been wasted by pathetic deception. He didn't even look at me. His claim was settled. His focus was entirely on the swift, brutal execution of justice. Alpha Daemon, Valen's voice was low, resonating with final authority. You rejected the true elemental heir and championed a fraud who dared to trespass on my court. Your crime is unforgivable, both to the fates and to this realm. Daemon stood broken, his alpha pride utterly destroyed. He had chosen greed and false strength over destiny, and the sight of me, safe and claimed behind Valen, was the deepest cut. He could only manage a defeated nod. Valen then turned his lethal gaze to Lysandra, who was sobbing hysterically, realizing she had gammed everything and lost. As for you, the king continued, your treachery nearly led to war. You brought a lie into my sight. He didn't sentence them to death, a mercy that spoke more to the political wisdom of not creating martyrs than to any kindness. But what he decreed was far worse for wolves consumed by power and status. I strip you both of any claim to the elementals. You are banished from the northern territories. You and your immediate followers are exiled, not for a month, or a year, but forever. You will leave my borders before the sun sets, and if I ever catch your scent again, you will be hunted without mercy. He raised his hand and brought it down hard, the sound a sharp crack of finality. Go. The captain of the guard immediately moved in. Daemon, too shocked and shamed to resist, was roughly seized. He risked one final, agonizing glance at me, a look of pure, gut-wrenching regret and understanding of what he had thrown away. Lysandra, however, fought. She screamed, clawed, and cursed my aunt, Daemon, and me. You will pay for this, Elara. You pathetic null. You won't keep him. I will return. I will. Her threats were cut short as two powerful guards dragged them from the palace. Lysandra's hysterical screams faded down the cold stone corridors, a haunting echo of her monumental defeat. The king's justice was swift and absolute. The audience chamber, though cleared of the enemies, was still thick with the volatile energy of the bond that had been affirmed, and the rejection that had been avenged. Valen turned to face me. He didn't speak a word of comfort. Instead, he simply reached out, pulling my trembling body away from the wall and directly into his demanding embrace. He held me hard against his chest, burying his face in my hair, inhaling deeply. It wasn't tender, it was purely, savagely possessive. He was scent-marking me, overriding the lingering ghost of Daemon's scent with the overwhelming force of his own. The battle for my destiny was over, but the intimate, private claiming had just begun. Chapter 18. The moment King Valen dragged me against his body, the last remnants of composure fled. We were alone in the vast audience chamber, surrounded by the silence of his dismissed court. The intense, possessive rage he displayed for my protection instantly transmuted into something far more dangerous, raw, uninhibited desire. His hands, which had been so careful not to break me, were now large, hot anchors against my lower back. He didn't ask, he commanded my response with his sheer presence. The mate bond was roaring, demanding connection, completion, and the cessation of the agonizing, constant bond heat that had plagued me for days. He lifted me slightly, pinning me against a nearby stone pillar. The cool stone pressed against my spine, a stark contrast to the searing heat radiating from his body. Mine, he growled against my ear, the sound dark and primal. His breath was hot, smelling of the wine he'd had earlier and the potent cedar scent of his wolf. You are mine, and every wolf in the realm will know it. My hands instinctively fisted in the thick fur of his cloak, holding on for dear life. I was drowning in the sheer, animalistic intensity of his need, which mirrored my own desperate, consuming craving. The rejection had left me craving to be wanted, and Valen was taking me with a terrifying, absolute hunger. His mouth descended, capturing mine in a kiss that was anything but tender. It was a claiming, a devouring, a violent assertion of ownership. He kissed me with the fury of a king who had just fought for his chosen mate. He broke the kiss only to rake his lips across my jaw, trailing fire down to the delicate skin of my neck. I gasped, tilting my head back, offering him access, begging him to take the final step. He nearly loses control. His muscles were steel, trembling slightly with the effort to hold back. His hands slid up, gripping my shoulders, then roughly tearing the collar of the borrowed gown down just enough to expose the vulnerable juncture of my neck and shoulder. This wasn't a soft promise, it was an urgent, primal necessity. He bit me. It wasn't the deep, bloody claiming bite that would irrevocably seal our bond before the fates. It was a deliberate, sharp light bite, enough to break the skin, enough to draw a gasp of pain and electric pleasure from my throat. He didn't sever the arteries, he simply sunk his canines just deep enough to mark the tissue and embed his potent scent. Then, he raked his tongue over the fresh wound, mingling his saliva with my blood, fully leaving his scent, cedar, smoke, and unrivaled dominance, on my pulse point. The effect was instantaneous and staggering. The pain faded, replaced by a surge of intoxicated calm. The half mark was a shock to my system, a temporary seal on the bond, a public announcement of possession, and a massive hit of pleasure. He pulled back, his eyes black with effort and triumphant possession. He pressed his forehead to mine, breathing raggedly. "Not yet," he rasped, his voice raw with denial. "Not until you are stronger, little wolf. Not until you know the power of what you are." He held me there, pinned, marked, and utterly breathless. We don't complete the bond yet, but the scene was a brutal, possessive promise of the absolute fire to come. I was his now, publicly and physically, scarred with his scent and his claim. Chapter 19. The days following King Valen's brutal, possessive half-mark were a blur of intense physical and emotional recovery. I was no longer shivering from rejection fever, but constantly simmering with a controlled, agonizing heat. Valen's scent, now permanently etched into my shoulder, was a powerful, intoxicating bomb that stabilized me but amplified my need for him tenfold. Under the protection of his palace and the overwhelming dominance of his presence, the impossible started to happen. My body was finally safe. The constant, primal fear of abandonment, rejection, and exposure was gone, replaced by the crushing weight of Valen's possessive certainty. My survival instinct, which had suppressed my inner spirit for years, finally ceded control. It happened late one evening in the royal library. Valen was working late, his broad back to me as he reviewed ancient maps. I was curled in an armchair, the elemental seal warm against my chest, trying to ignore the familiar, maddening thrum of our bond. I looked down at my hands, resting loosely in my lap. They felt heavy, strangely unfamiliar. Suddenly, a sensation unlike anything I'd ever known pulsed in my chest. It wasn't the bond, but something inside me. It was raw, wild, and fiercely protective. It was my other half, a spirit that had been buried in the silence, finally stirring. My wolf awakens. It wasn't a visible shift, but an internal, seismic event. I gasped, clutching my throat, trying to stifle the sound. The silence was gone. In its place was a quiet, intense presence, a wild female spirit that felt bruised, wary, but utterly magnificent. She was fire and earth, wind and water, and she was mine. The shock was so intense, I nearly slid off the chair. Valen heard my sharp intake of breath. He turned instantly, his silver eyes narrowing. He didn't ask what was wrong. He looked, and his senses, heightened by our recent half-bond, recognized the fundamental shift in my essence. "What is it?" he growled, already striding toward me. I can feel her," I whispered, the words trembling. "She's here. She's awake." A dark, triumphant smile, the first true, unreserved smile I'd ever seen from him, stretched his lips. It made him look less king, and more utterly lethal alpha. He knelt beside the chair, taking my face between his large hands, his eyes searching mine. "Show me, little queen," he challenged softly. I focused on the wild, powerful presence surging inside me, the spirit that had chosen this moment, under this protection, to finally emerge. The bond heat intensified, mixing with the heady pride of my awakened wolf. Valen kissed me, not with possession this time, but with reverence and absolute approval. It was a deep, consuming kiss that encouraged the nascent power within, and in the middle of their kiss, my eyes flashed. It was only a flicker, a brief, glorious burst of gold and deepest red, the colors of fire and dominion. The moment their lips parted, the color receded, leaving my human gaze, but Valen had seen it. Her eyes glowed during their kiss. He pulled back, his breathing heavy, his expression one of possessive awe. "There she is," he whispered, a deep, possessive rumble that thrilled my newly awakened spirit. "My elemental queen. Never doubt your power again, Elara. Never doubt your worth." The invisible girl was finally gone. In her place, a nascent elemental wolf was taking its first breath under the iron guardianship of her ruthless king. Chapter 20. With my wolf finally awake, a potent, simmering ember in my soul, King Valen decided it was time for the final, definitive test. My aunt's testimony and the blood test were enough for the court, but the elemental elders, a secretive council of powerful, ancient wolves who served the bloodline, required absolute proof. They needed the artifact itself to acknowledge me. The ceremony was held in a private, ancient chamber deep beneath the fortress, where the air was cold and heavy with centuries of unspoken power. The 4 elders sat in a crescent, their eyes hard and assessing. Valen stood just behind me, a silent, immovable force of possessive assurance. One elder, a woman whose face was a roadmap of wrinkles, spoke. "The blood burns, Queen Elara. But the seal is the key. Only the rightful heir can wield its power. You must command it." My heart hammered against my ribs, right beneath the cool, heavy weight of the obsidian. "If the seal rejects you, child," another elder warned, his voice a low rasp, "the power it holds will strip you bare." The fear was real, but now, so was the courage of my newly awakened wolf. She was a silent, ferocious energy inside me, refusing to let me succumb to the old shame. "We belong here," she purred in my mind. Valen slipped his hand to the back of my neck, his thumb resting gently over the half mark, channeling his immense strength directly into me. "Anchor." I reached up and slowly unclasped the leather cord. The elemental seal was rough and cold in my palm, a silent, unyielding stone. "It is my birthright," I whispered, addressing the stone, but speaking to the defiant, powerful spirit inside me. "I am the vessel. I am the daughter of the blood." I closed my fingers around the seal and squeezed, focusing all the raw emotion, the pain of Daemon rejection, the dizzying certainty of Valen's claim, and the fierce, protective surge of my awakened wolf, into the obsidian. Nothing happened. The elders exchanged grim, knowing looks. The silence stretched, thick with impending failure. "Focus the fire within, child," Valen growled softly, his voice meant for my ears alone. The fire. I thought of the king's fury, the demanding heat of our bond, the flames that had briefly erupted in the test water. I channeled the heat of my burgeoning mate bond, the uncontrollable craving, into my hand. And then, it began. A terrifying, searing heat erupted from the stone. It didn't just warm my hand, it felt like I was grasping a burning coal. The seal, dormant for years, was reacting. I cried out, dropping the obsidian onto the stone pedestal before me. The moment it hit the stone, the obsidian didn't shatter. It pulsed with a deep, furious red light. My hand was scorched, blistered, but my blood had been drawn in the initial command. A trickle of the fresh, burnt blood from my palm dripped onto the seal. The seal burns in her palm, reacting only to her blood. The red light intensified, swirling with gold and crimson. It didn't reject the blood, it drank it. The light became a brilliant, blinding beacon, and the seal levitated inches above the pedestal, humming with a frequency that vibrated in my teeth. It held there for a moment of breathtaking power, confirming its mistress, before gently floating back down. When I reached for it, the heat was gone. It was cool, quiet, and now felt like an extension of my own arm, a weapon waiting to be wielded. The elders rose, bowing low. The blood has spoken, the head elder declared, her voice filled with ancient respect. She is the elemental queen. I looked at Valen, my eyes shimmering with a mix of exhaustion and triumph. He didn't bow. He simply walked to my side, seized my hand, ignoring the blistered palm, and brought it to his lips, kissing my victorious wound. Well done, my queen, he whispered, a possessive promise in his tone. The power was mine, but the glory, and the credit, belonged to him. Chapter 21. The acknowledgement of the seal had settled the political unrest, but it had ignited a far more intimate storm. With the spirit wolf awake and the ancestral artifact attuned to my blood, the dormant elemental power was ready to manifest. The internal shift was agonizingly slow, a relentless, burning pressure that intensified whenever King Valen was near. The bond heat was no longer just desire. It felt like a volatile chemical reaction threatening to explode. Valen, keenly aware of the building pressure, kept his distance, testing my control while simultaneously fueling my craving with his powerful, inescapable scent. One evening, the control snapped. We were alone in the privacy of his royal suite. The atmosphere was heavy, charged with unspoken need. Valen was standing near the massive stone fireplace, the orange glow casting his features into sharp relief. I was across the room, desperately trying to read, but my heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. You're distracted, Elara, he noted, his voice a low, rough challenge. Your presence is distracting, I shot back, the honesty forced out by the sheer agony of my body's escalating demand. My skin felt too tight, my blood too hot. He didn't move, but the temperature in the room seemed to spike. Then come here and confront it. I didn't need a second invitation. Driven by the fierce, protective growl of my newly awakened wolf, I launched myself across the room. I wasn't seeking comfort, I was seeking release. I crashed into him, my arms wrapping around his waist, clinging to him like a lifeline. He groaned, the sound deep and immediate, his massive arms instantly tightening around me, crushing me to his rigid, powerful form. The contact was a supernova. The mate bond exploded with such ferocity that my vision grayed at the edges. This wasn't just heat, this was combustion. He kissed me deeply, urgently, a desperate, mutual loss of control. His hands fisted in my hair, tilting my head back, and my wolf, newly awake and utterly possessive, began to claw at my restraints. His fingers slipped beneath the heavy velvet of my robe, tracing the curve of my hip. The intimacy was overwhelming, pushing the boundaries of my control. It happened as his thumb brushed the sensitive skin of my inner thigh. The internal pressure found its release point. Instead of a surge of pleasure, a jolt of terrifying, unfamiliar energy shot from my core down my arm. My hand, resting against the stone mantle of the fireplace, suddenly felt scorching hot. I gasped, pulling back from the kiss, staring at my fingertips. Curling tentatively, then with an increasing, vibrant defiance, small tendrils of intense orange flames began to lick around my index and middle fingers. They were silent, controlled, and utterly beautiful. Flames curl around her fingertips, her first true power. I stared, mesmerized and terrified, at the fire emerging from my own flesh. The tiny flames were hot, but they didn't burn my skin. They were an extension of my will, a manifestation of the heat that had almost destroyed me. Valen watched, his breathing ragged, his silver eyes dark with pride and primal awe. He didn't pull away. He didn't try to smother the flames. There it is, he whispered, his voice thick with triumph. The fire of the queen. My power is nothing compared to the beauty of yours. He reached out and gently took my flaming hand in his own, his skin impervious to the heat. He interlaced our fingers, and the small flames danced between us, a tangible symbol of our volatile, powerful, and now elementally charged connection. I was no longer a null. I was fire, and my king was the only one who could touch the flame without being consumed. Chapter 22. The flickering orange glow of the elemental fire still danced between us, illuminating the profound moment of my first true manifestation. I was overwhelmed, awe mixed with the raw, dizzying terror of wielding a power I hadn't asked for. I pulled my hand back, watching the flames instantly retract, leaving my skin unharmed but humming with residual energy. A wave of doubt crashed over me, the residue of years of being called a null. It's too much, I whispered, shaking my head. I don't know how to control it. Damon was right. I was never ready for this. I'm afraid I'll burn the palace down. King Valen moved, closing the distance instantly. His arms clamped around me, pulling my fiery, trembling body into the unyielding safety of his embrace. He held me tighter than he ever had, and this time, the possession was laced with absolute, fierce adoration. He wasn't afraid of the fire. He was proud of it. He tilted my chin up, forcing my gaze to meet his molten silver eyes. The usual ruthlessness in his stare was tempered by a dark, possessive triumph. Listen to me, Elara, he growled, his voice deep and absolute, hitting my consciousness like a physical command. You don't need power to rule. You're already my queen. He didn't stop there. He leaned closer, his scent wrapping around me, the primal comfort of the Alpha Lord settling the tumultuous fears of my awakened wolf. But if you fear this fire, then we will harness it. You think you will burn this palace down? Good. Burn the world down, if you must. But you will do it from my side. He kissed the corner of my mouth, a heavy, possessive stamp of ownership. You will never apologize for your strength, and you will never fear your fire, because you are mine to protect and mine to possess. This power does not make you worthy. My choice makes you worthy. His raw, unwavering faith, the absolute certainty of his claim, was more stabilizing than any control mechanism. He had claimed the invisible girl, and now he fiercely championed the elemental queen. His words silenced the faint voice of doubt, the one that still sounded like Damon's sneering rejection. Valen had not claimed me for my power. He had claimed me for my destiny, and the power was merely a bonus. I finally leaned into his strength, letting the immense certainty of his body absorb my fear. The flames, responding to the calm, sparked briefly on my skin before receding completely. I was his queen, and under his ruthless tutelage, I would learn to wield the fire. Chapter 23. While the elemental fire solidified my place at King Valen's side, the man who had discarded me was crumbling in the desolate edges of exile. Damon, stripped of his alpha status and living in the meager, dishonorable quarters of the banished, was consumed by a relentless, poisonous regret. He hadn't just lost a mate, he had rejected the literal source of power that would have cemented his own weak rule. He had chosen Lysandra's pretty lie over the stark, terrifying truth of destiny. Every day in exile was a stark reminder of his profound failure. The whispers reached him, carried by disgruntled ex-pack members and spies. Elara is no longer wolf-less. She is the true queen. She wields the fire. The realization was a crushing blow. I was not only his fated mate, but I was the elemental wolf he had sneered at. The magnitude of his stupidity was unbearable. His body still remembered the brief, electric jolt of the true mate bond connection, a sensation that Lysandra's presence could never replicate. He began to spiral. Lysandra, now realizing her power was useless and her future grim, had become viciously cruel, her constant accusations of his failure driving him deeper into despair. One night, driven by desperation, Damon made a foolhardy decision. He knew he had to see me, to beg for a chance at redemption, at regaining the power he had thrown away. He had to convince me to choose him, the original mate, over the ruthless king who had claimed me. He slipped past Valen's outer patrols, a ghost of his former imposing self, smelling faintly of shame and desperation. He found a way to a private garden near my chambers, waiting in the shadows until I stepped out for a moment of solitary contemplation, the elemental seal warm against my neck. Elara, he rasped, his voice hoarse, a shadow of the commanding alpha I remembered. I spun around, recognizing the scent immediately. It was weak, tainted by exile, and laced with palpable despair. My wolf, now awake, gave a low, uninterested snarl in my mind. He stumbled toward me, sinking to his knees on the cold stone. He wasn't kneeling to me out of respect, but out of absolute, pitiful defeat. I crawl back, he choked out, tears running down his face. I know the truth, Elara. I was a fool. I chose pride over destiny, and I deserve this exile. But the bond, it was real. I can feel the loss. I beg you, take me back. Come back to your pack. I will honor you now. I will treat you as the queen you are. He looked up at me, his eyes wide and pleading. Then, in a final, humiliating act of desperation, he lowered his head and offered his body in total submission. I will give you anything you want, he whispered. Take my body, take my title. Just don't leave me banished and alone. The sight was pathetic. This was the man who had publicly crushed my soul, reduced to groveling for power. The memory of his sneer, "A wolf without power has no place in my bed," was sharper than any blade. But I felt no pity. I felt cold, absolute finality. Chapter 24. The sight of Daemon, the once mighty alpha, reduced to a weeping, groveling shadow, should have been satisfying. But standing over him, I felt only a profound, cold stillness. The intense rush of my awakened wolfhood stripped away the last vestiges of my naive attachment to him. I looked at his bowed head, his pathetic desperation for the power he'd thrown away, and the memory of my own humiliation. The tears, the fever, the silent plea for him to just see me, washed over me. This wasn't redemption. This was simply a power grab. I didn't move toward him or away. I stood in the full, powerful aura of King Valen's claim, the obsidian seal warm against my skin, my wolf standing silent and fiercely indifferent. Get up, Daemon, I commanded, my voice flat, devoid of the emotion he was so clearly hoping to exploit. The sound was unfamiliar to me, strong, steady, and utterly dismissive. He slowly rose to his feet, shame and hope warring in his eyes. Elara, please. We were fated. Valen is just a brute, a possessor. I cut him off, a sharp, bitter laugh escaping my lips. It wasn't hysterical or painful, but a sound of clear, cutting triumph. You were too weak to keep me, I stated, my gaze boring into his. You had the true mate bond, the true power, and you broke it because you were afraid of a little risk. You chose a shiny lie over the difficult truth. I took a deliberate step toward him, forcing him to take a defensive step back. The shift in our dynamic, him shrinking, me dominating, was dizzying. Valen is many things, I continued, gesturing to the half mark still visible on my shoulder. But he is not weak. He saw my lack of power and claimed me anyway, kneeling before his entire court. He ignited the fire you mothered. I paused, letting the power of my silence settle over him, letting him witness the undeniable aura of the elemental queen he had created through his cruelty. Now I'm too strong to want you. It was the mirror rejection. Daemon had rejected me for my weakness. I was rejecting him for his. I didn't need his pity, his title, or his pathetic, submitted body. I had a king who commanded the respect Daemon was now begging for. Daemon's face crumpled, the finality of my words landing with the force of a physical blow. He realized he hadn't just lost a mate, he had lost his entire future. He turned away without another word, sprinting back into the night, exiled and utterly broken. The scent of his despair was swiftly carried away by the wind. I watched him go, feeling a strange sense of closure. The past was truly severed. I was no longer defined by his rejection. I turned back toward the fortress, toward the king who had salvaged my destiny. But as I walked away, a new, insidious fear pricked at my newfound confidence. Lysandra. Daemon might be broken, but my jealous cousin was still out there, her rage fueled by the very exile she now shared. Chapter 25. While Daemon crawled back into the wilderness, a broken wretch consumed by regret, Lysandra was consumed by something far more dangerous, a chilling, calculated thirst for vengeance. Her shame was no longer directed at herself, but entirely focused on me, Elara, the Null, who had somehow stolen her power, her king, and her future. The exile had only hardened her resolve. She was intelligent, cunning, and now had nothing left to lose. She didn't mourn the loss of Daemon, she saw him as a tool she had failed to use effectively. Lysandra used the remaining connections she had, ones forged in the darker, more desperate corners of the supernatural world. She knew that King Valen's power, though vast, had enemies, fringe covens, exiled wolves, and creatures who thrived in chaos and coveted the elemental seal. She traveled to the shadows of the Forbidden Mountains, finding an old, vicious coven of dark forces who had long desired the elemental power for their own nefarious purposes. These weren't honorable wolves, they were scavengers and power brokers. She offered them a deal: access to the king's fortress, a distraction during the upcoming elemental trial, and the seal itself, in exchange for their help in toppling Valen and, more importantly, in destroying me. The girl is weak, Lysandra sneered, her voice now cold and devoid of the hysteria she'd shown in the throne room. She only recently manifested her power. The king is blinded by his foolish bond. Strike during the trial, and she will be exposed as the fragile vessel she is. The coven agreed. They cared nothing for Lysandra's alpha status. They wanted the ancient power I possessed. The cousin allies with dark forces, planning to topple the king and FMC. Her plan was devastatingly simple. She would lead an attack on the palace when I was at my most vulnerable, mid-trial, struggling to control the volatile, newborn elemental flames. She knew the trial would drain me, and the subsequent chaos would force Valen to choose between defending his throne and defending his mate. Lysandra smiled for the first time since her exile. It was not the beautiful, golden smile of a Luna. It was the sharp, ugly smile of a true villain. She had been publicly ruined, and she would now ensure that my triumph was equally short-lived, spectacular, and bloody. The greatest danger was not the alpha who rejected me, but the cousin whose jealousy had metastasized into absolute, dark power. Chapter 26. The shadow of Lysandra's impending vengeance was an invisible chill, but it couldn't penetrate the overwhelming heat of the fortress. It was time for the elemental trial, the final, ancient rite that would fully integrate my newly awakened power with my soul. The trial was held in the same subterranean chamber where the elders had witnessed the seal's call. 4 massive, ancient braziers stood at the corners, currently cold, awaiting my command. The atmosphere was heavy, not just with age, but with the volatile anticipation of powerful magic. I stood in the center, clad only in a simple white linen shift. My heart hammered, not from fear of the fire, but from the fear of failure. King Valen stood at the edge of the chamber, his powerful presence a necessary anchor but also a crushing pressure. He was dressed in his war leather, his silver eyes blazing with a mixture of possessive concern and absolute command. He knew the risk, but he knew this was the final step to claiming my destiny. The head elder handed me the elemental seal. The obsidian was heavy, warm, and thrumming with my blood. Queen Elara, the elder's voice echoed. The trial requires you to summon the pure elemental core. You must master the fire, or it will consume the weak vessel. I closed my eyes and reached inward, past the intense, constant draw of the mate bond, past the fierce, ready-to-fight instincts of my awakened wolf. I reached for the core of power that had sparked to life on my fingertips. I channeled the energy into the braziers. It wasn't my will that drove the power, it was the raw, demanding presence of my wolf, now fully aware of her lineage. With a deep, resonant whoosh, the 4 braziers instantly erupted. But they didn't burn with normal fire. These were elemental flames, blindingly bright, searingly hot, and dangerously sentient. The heat was immediate and overwhelming. It wasn't the welcoming warmth of Valen's body, it was a hungry, demanding furnace. The air became liquid fire. I stumbled, bracing myself against the sheer force of the elements. I tried to command the flames, to draw them inward, but they roared higher, surrounding me in a tightening, suffocating ring. The ancient test was designed to push the air past her breaking point. The fire nearly consumed her. I gasped, the linen shift clinging to my sweat-drenched body. My skin felt like it was blistering, and the elemental energy in my core was violently overloading. I could feel my control slipping, the pure, raw power threatening to explode outward, not in a controlled spark, but in a devastating, uncontrolled conflagration. I'm going to fail. I'm going to burn. I cried out, a raw, desperate sound that was instantly drowned out by the roar of the flames. I wasn't fighting the fire anymore. I was drowning in it, the heat and the power far exceeding the fragile limits of my human form. The terror was absolute, but the danger was immediately recognized by the king. He took 1 step forward, ready to violate the sacred trial and pull me from the inferno. But then, my wolf took over. The pain of the fire, the pressure of the power, it all triggered an instinct more primal than fear. Chapter 27. The elemental fire was a consuming vortex, an unbearable pressure that threatened to tear my body apart. I was losing the battle for control, my human limits shattering under the strain. In that moment of utter desperation, my newly awakened wolf took over, driven by a single, instinctual imperative. Anchor. She didn't reach for my will or my strength. She reached for the mate bond. A guttural, high-pitched cry tore from my throat, a sound of pain that swiftly turned into a desperate, primal call. I ignored the roaring flames, ignoring the elders, ignoring everything but the magnetic pull of King Valen's immense power. My wolf, in a panicked attempt to survive the elemental overload, physically dragged her mind, her spirit, and her desperate heat toward the only source of stability she knew. I launched myself through the ring of fire, the heat scorching my skin but unable to deter the pure, overwhelming force of the bond. I didn't stop until I collided with Valen's rock-solid body. He caught me instantly, his arms locking around my waist as my body began to convulse with uncontrolled energy. The impact was not just physical, it was an explosive union of two souls. The resulting bond heat was instantaneous and devastating. It was more than desire, it was a desperate, elemental need for completion. The intense, agonizing fire surrounding us was suddenly mirrored inside me. A volcanic surge demanding release, demanding the final, irrevocable claiming. Valen. I choked out his name, my hands tearing at the buckle of his war belt, driven by a fierce, wild urgency that was completely non-negotiable. His silver eyes, which had been wide with alarm, narrowed instantly with raw, possessive hunger. He understood the stakes. The trial's chaos had triggered a catastrophic physical imperative. My power was overloading, and only the final, binding act of the mate bond could ground the volatile energy. He crushed his mouth to mine, accepting the desperation, matching it with his own primal force. His hands dove beneath my scorched linen shift, tearing the fragile fabric aside. They almost complete the bond in desperation. We were a tangle of desperate limbs and roaring desire, surrounded by the terrifying elemental flames that mirrored the fire consuming our bodies. It was raw, urgent, and fueled by survival. The scent of fire, smoke, sweat, and absolute need filled the chamber. He slammed my back against the nearest stone pillar, his body a heavy, glorious weight pressing me into the cold surface. He was seconds away from taking the final, necessary step, allowing the bond to seal fully, saving me from the self-combustion of the trial. But then, the final, agonizing surge of elemental fire erupted from my palm. An uncontrolled blast of pure energy that slammed harmlessly into the pillar next to his head. Valen stopped. He was rigid, his control hanging by a thread, his breath ragged against my neck. He recognized the danger. If the bond sealed now, while my power was so unstable, the shockwave of the elemental claim might not just ground me. It might burn us both alive. He pulled his hips back, a groan of pure, tortured denial ripping from his throat. The king chose control over consumption, protection over possession. Control, little wolf, he grated against my skin, his words a desperate, powerful command. Focus the fire. I will not let you burn out on instinct. He hadn't ended the trial, he had become the trial itself. Chapter 28. The king's forced withdrawal, though agonizing, was the salvation I didn't know I needed. Valen remained a wall pressed against me, his body shaking with the immense effort of denying the full mate bond, but he had pulled me back from the elemental brink. The intense bond heat was still a raging tide, but he was my shore. He didn't release me. He simply held me captive against the cold pillar, his hips pressed against mine, his iron control the only thing keeping us from descending into the raw, urgent completion the bond demanded. Look at the flames, Elara, he grated, his voice a tight, demanding whisper in my ear. He was focusing all his willpower, and all his immense alpha power, on grounding me. I forced my eyes open, past the haze of lust and pain. The elemental flames still roared around us, hot, chaotic, and consuming. But now, they seemed different. They were mirroring my internal state. You are fire, little wolf, he growled, using the nickname not as an endearment, but as a command. But you are also elemental. You have earth, air, and water within you. You must command the flames, not surrender to them. He shifted his head, his lips brushing the half mark on my shoulder, a possessive, stabilizing action. You'll burn the world down, little wolf, but never me, he vowed, his breath warm and intoxicating. His meaning was clear. His power was absolute, his claim was final, and he was the only one strong enough to withstand my untamed fire. He was the anchor. I took a shaky breath, clinging to the pure certainty of his presence. His faith was the missing piece of my control. I focused on his scent, on the iron certainty of his heart beating against my ear, and reached inward again, not for raw power, but for stillness. My awakened wolf, recognizing the desperate necessity of survival and recognizing the absolute strength of her mate, finally submitted to the control being offered. She pulled the volatile energy inward, away from the roaring exterior flames, and channeled it through the steady, powerful flow of our burgeoning bond. The effect was immediate and dizzying. The intense, burning pressure in my core did not vanish, but it stabilized. The chaotic flames around us responded, shrinking slightly, the colors shifting from angry orange to a deep, controlled crimson. I was breathing again. I was stable. Valen felt the shift. With a final, deep exhale, he pulled back just enough to look into my eyes. His silver gaze was dark, heavy with relief and simmering hunger. "Good," he murmured, his thumb stroking my jaw. "Now, command the rest. Show them the Queen's control." The king had not saved me, he had forced me to save myself, using his possessive strength as the necessary foundation. The agonizing trial was far from over, but the most dangerous part, the self-destruction, had passed. I was anchored, claimed, and finally, fiercely in control. Chapter 29. With King Valen serving as my immovable anchor, the final phase of the elemental trial began. The primal heat of our bond, instead of consuming me, became a focused, controlled forge for my power. I stood tall, the cool sensation of the elemental seal on my neck now feeling like a weight of certainty. My wolf, fierce and synchronized with the king's will, was no longer terrified. She was ready to command. I stared at the 4 towering braziers. The flames still roared, but the chaos was gone. They obeyed the new law, my will. I spread my hands, reaching inward for the pure, untapped essence of my elemental heritage. I didn't summon the destructive, chaotic fire I'd first feared. I summoned the balance. In my left hand, the crimson fire flared, sharp and hot, acknowledging the king's heat. But in my right, a shimmering mist of silver water and a faint dusting of rich, dark earth began to coalesce. I was not just fire, I was the complete element. With a definitive snarl that echoed the absolute certainty of my mate, I swept my arms wide. I commanded the internal pressure, the volatile energy, to integrate with my soul. The braziers responded instantly. The roaring flames sank, changing from crimson to a vibrant, stable gold. The air, which had been scorching, filled with the fresh scent of ozone and wet earth. The trial chamber was now a harmony of the elements, responding to the will of their true mistress. The pressure inside me, the tight, agonizing coil of power, finally released. Not in an explosion, but in a sublime, dizzying surge of pure integration. It felt like every broken piece of me, the wolf-less girl, the rejected mate, the timid niece, snapped into a glorious, terrifying whole. I had mastered the trial. I stood, untouched by the flames, fully awakened as elemental queen. I looked at the elders. They were kneeling, their heads bowed low in reverence. I turned to Valen. He was no longer just the king, he was my mate, my anchor, and my possessor. His silver eyes were alight with a fierce, primal pride, and his lips curved into a slow, utterly devastating smirk. He walked toward me, breaking the ancient silence of the chamber. He didn't check my power, he checked his claim. He reached up, cupped my face, and kissed me deeply, his scent marking me for the 1000th time. This kiss was not desperate or demanding. It was celebratory, possessive, and thick with the promise of future rule. "You are fire, you are earth, you are queen," he murmured against my mouth, his voice a low vibration that thrilled my soul. "And you are irrevocably mine." My strength was absolute. My claim was proven.